Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Just when there was hope the Syrian international proxy war could be coming to an end, Israel inserted itself into the conflict in a big way. Airstrikes against Syrian targets have not only witnessed Damascus forcefully react, but also has Moscow demanding explanations. Cross-talking the latest in the Syrian conflict, I'm joined by my guest, Ramzy Baroud in Seattle. He's an author, journalist, and political analyst. In Washington, we have Dan Arbell. He is a scholar in residence at the Center for Israeli Studies at the American University. And in Beirut, we cross to Martin Jay. He is a freelance broadcast journalist. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Ramzy, you got up earliest for the program. I very much appreciate it. We had a new twist in the conflict in Syria. We had Israeli jets going into Syrian airspace, hitting a target. This time, Damascus reacted, and this is something new. We had the Israeli ambassador called here in Moscow for an explanation. We have also the foreign minister of Israel saying that any kind of reaction from Damascus, a military reaction, will be met with, well, I'll use my own words, devastating force here. How important is all of this, and what is, the way you read it, Israel's angle in all of this? Go ahead, Ramzy in Seattle.
I think it's very important what's happening, and indeed there is a new twist to this conflict. The twist is not in the fact that Israel has bombed Syria. Israel has been bombing Syria relentlessly for years, and we can't forget the Israeli bombing of Syria in 2007 in Deir ez-Zor, where they took it upon themselves to bomb what they described was a nuclear facility. Since then, Israel has bombed Syria routinely. The new twist in the story is that Syria responded. And the fact that Syria responded with such determination also indicates that Syria made that response with the understanding that the Russians are aware of the fact that Syria was about to respond. And I think this is what's really very interesting, and that's what's getting Avigdor Lieberman particularly angry. He feels that Israel being the only bully in town is no longer applicable, and Syria is now counting on Russian support, is able to at least attempt to defend itself.
Dan, would you like to react to that? Because we have up to this point during this crisis in Syria, the Russians and the Israelis have had consultations so they don't bump into each other. But this time, the Russians wanted some explanations. What's new this time round? Go ahead, Dan.
Well, for the last 5 years since the Syrian conflict started, or 6 years, Israel has kept a very low profile, not involved in the Syrian crisis whatsoever. Trying to stay away, marking the red lines from Israel's point of view. Once those red lines are crossed, then Israel reacts. But Israel is in a reactive mode when it comes to the Syrian crisis. Israel had very limited scale attacks in Syria, only when it crossed Israeli red lines, such as supply of weapons, sophisticated weapons to Hezbollah, or breaching of Israeli sovereignty, or Iranian officers close to the Israeli-Syrian international border. This time around, Israel felt the need to respond because there was a 200-kilo bomb directed at the center of Israel and could put an Israeli settlement or village in harm's way. So Israel needed to respond. Israel reserves the right to respond, and I think that Israel has no quarrel with Russia about that. Netanyahu and Putin met 4 times in the last 18
absolutely.
months. There are very good relations in that sense. And so this time around, I think that Israel and Russia do have understandings between them, and they needed to iron out these understandings once more as Israel reacted to this endangerment on its border.
Okay, Martin, I mean, if you look what's happened because of this international proxy war being played out in Syria, you have an increased profile of Iran, you have an increased profile of Hezbollah, you have a government in Damascus that is held on, and it looks like it's going to stay on. We don't see Mr. Trump arming terrorist groups or other groups inside of Syria. At least he's backed off from that. We don't see evidence that money and support is there now. That could change here. This is all a net loss for Israel, and and it's really kind of ironic because Syria was, maybe it was a rival hostile power to Israel before this conflict came about, but now all these things I just mentioned certainly are something that the Israelis wouldn't have wanted to happen, but it has happened, and it's because of this international proxy war that's being played out in Syria. Go ahead.
Well, a lot has changed. I mean, it's not just in the recent weeks, but also in recent years. If you go way back to the very beginning, Israel had almost a cordial relationship with the Assad government. I mean, it wasn't a very good relationship, but it seemed to work, and there seemed to be a certain unwritten agreement over Golan Heights. But a lot has changed over the years, and I think in recent weeks, what's interesting, what's the twist, if you want to use that particular phrase, I think, is that the relations between Assad and Mr. Putin have strengthened. Yep. And this was something that pundits such as myself and other journalists in the region were always saying, that perhaps Russia-Syria relations were the weakest link, and that Russia had stronger relations with Iran, but actually that it wasn't such a strong bond there. In fact, I think there is. I think these relations are galvanizing now. And if you just look at the rhetoric of Mr. Assad in the last few days, how he's actually has made threats for the first time and launched a ballistic missile for the first time against Israel, that's quite unprecedented. But look at it from the Israelis' perspective, things aren't looking good for them. I mean, they've got a difficult situation here. Peace is breaking out in the Middle East. The Russians are pushing ahead on a peace plan which would involve autonomous regions in Syria, which Assad rejected a few weeks ago, but now seems to be warming to. And maybe that's part of the deal. Maybe that's what's made things stronger between the two, and that's what's contributed in part to this new bravado from Assad. But if we look forward, if such peace can come about, that doesn't necessarily represent a good thing for Israel, because there are so many problems there. First of all, that would mean Hezbollah putting out of Syria and going back to Lebanon, which is not a good thing at all for Israel. And secondly, I think it's really important to look at exactly what happened when the airstrike took place and what was the background to it. At the moment, both Israel and Lebanon, or Hezbollah in Lebanon, are preparing for a war. And that war may not be very soon. It might be in a year's time or 18 months' time. But moving the latest technology, surface-to-air missiles, from Syria into Lebanon is something that the Israelis are very, very hot on, because they're beginning to see that actually all the odds are beginning to stack up against them.
Okay, Ramzy in Seattle, you were nodding your head at some point there. You want to react to what Dan and Martin have had to say here? Go ahead.
Well, I think there's a technical difference here between what Dan is saying and what I'm saying, is that, when it comes to the Syrians attempting to defend themselves, regardless how you feel about the Syrian government of Bashar Assad, if they attempt to defend themselves, it's not an act of aggression.
Absolutely.
So Israel, by instigating violence against Syria, and Syria attempting to defend itself, and the Israeli defense minister start thumping his chest saying that if you do this ever again, I will wipe out your entire defense system. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. It's irrational. And needless to say, what Israel is doing in Syria is illegal to begin with. But I think it's really important also here to note that Israel must be aware of the fact that there is an end game that is being formulated in Syria. And this is indeed very worrying. I agree with what Martin said, in the sense that Israel has been counting on the fact that the status quo, this bedlam, this chaos, to carry on for a long, long time. In fact, Moshe Yalon, the Israeli defense minister, said that, I believe in January of last year. He said, we would rather live with an ISIS-controlled Syria than with the return of the control of the Syrian government all over the country. This assertion was actually repeated by the head of the Defense Intelligence, General Halavi, I believe, in June of last year, where he made the same statements. We would rather live with ISIS, not with the Syrian regime. Now, the fact that there is an end game, the nature of the alliances are changing, the United States is kind of keeping to the margins, Russia is gaining more and more the upper hand in Syria. This is very, very worrying for Israel, and this is why I think the particularly loaded language by the Israeli defense minister really does indicate a degree of very serious concern, actually.
All right, Dan, a lot's been said here. Dan, do you want to react to what you just heard there? Go ahead.
First of all, what Martin said about Israel and Syria pre-Syrian crisis being in a cordial relationship, I agree with that. And Israel and Syria were on the verge of reaching a peace deal both in 2000 and later in 2007 and 2008. It did not work out. But pre-crisis, Israel and Syria were in a cordial relationship. I agree with that. After the crisis started, then Israel was hoping for Assad to step down or phase out. Right now, Israel sees Assad pretty strengthened and, of course, is monitoring the situation very closely. But Israel is not siding with any force in this conflict, and Israel is staying within its confines, within its borders, and chooses surgical strikes when it feels necessary to protect Israeli interests. So I don't see any escalation in Israeli activity. Obviously, Israel is wary of the situation. Obviously, Israel is following it closely. And obviously, the words of the defense minister reflect the sense that Israel will not tolerate, will not go with a business-as-usual approach if its red lines are crossed, and that's how we should see it.
I mean,
Dan, more than that.
Dan, I mean, Syria is a sovereign country. I mean, its red lines are its borders, isn't it? Its red line is its sovereignty. I mean, can Israel say, look at other people having their own interest as well as being legitimate? Because you don't seem to be treating the sovereignty of Syria as meaning anything at all.
Well, you know, talking about Syria as a sovereign state these days is kind of, I guess, does not reflect what the situation on the ground. There are forces at play right now.
Well, if you don't mind
Syria
me
is
jumping
anything
in,
but
Peter.
a organized, homogeneous state. It's nothing.
All right, Dan.
Really,
Dan.
The Assad forces against other forces.
I have to go to a hard break, gentlemen. After a short break, we'll continue our discussion on Syria. Stay with RT.
What do you think about sanctions?
Easy, right or wrong, but I definitely think sanctions are better than conflict.
You don't perform for diplomatic reasons. You perform for humanitarian ways.
I'm talking obviously about Edward Snowden.
I believe he's a hero. I believe he's coming directly from his heart.
أنا قصتي إني ألبس الجلابية عشاني. القصة بتاعتي عشان ألبس الجلابية عشان أشتغل وسط الرجال 6 أشهر بطل. أما طب هعمل منها وكني قعدت 40 يوم نفستني المرحومة وأنت تدي وده يدي الله يرحمه سامحها.
30 or 40 years ago, she be a young lady and she cannot live between as a man. If she not a man in the street, she can stay in the street, sleep in the road. Jalabia make her no scared of anybody.
أنا أتعب وأنا أتجوز تاني. أتعب وآكل الزلط وأوكل نفسي في الزلط والطين وأنا وبنتي وأنا أدور على راجل تاني. عايز أبقى نظيفة ولا راجل عيفة.
What politicians do is something we don't do. They put themselves on the line, and they get accepted or rejected. So when you want to be president, why would you want to be? Why would someone want to be president? What's it like to be president? What's it like when the phone rings at 3 in the morning? Can't be a good call. I'm interested always in the whys and the hows.
And Q Larry. Question more.
You can see the border from here by the long steel fence that goes down this side, Goes all the way down.
Like I said, this is autumn land, and this is autumn land. I have every right to be here. I have a right to go collect my food, be a part of my families on both sides of the border.
I started an organization called Arizona Border Recon. We are a standalone entity that is doing what needs to be done. In the 5 years, it's getting worse. The violence is escalating because it's no man's land.
Ranchers really get irate when somebody calls it a no man's land. They believe that their ranch is their ranch, and they don't believe that their federal government is taking responsibility for their security like they would for anywhere else in the country. Others?
Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the latest events in Syria. Okay, right before we went to the break, Ramzy, you wanted to respond to something that Dan was saying. Please go right ahead.
What really, it doesn't really shock me anymore. We are used to it. It's just the way that Dan and others would talk about Israel. It's right to conduct, to conduct surgical strikes anywhere, assassinations, kidnappings, whatever, whenever it feels that its red line has been crossed. Imagine if this logic applies to Syria, to Lebanon, to the Palestinians, to anybody. They would have been rendered pariah states a long, long time ago. Israel somehow is the exception, and Dan wants it to remain the exception. And his justification when he answered your question, well, Syria is a sovereign state, you said, and he said, well, right now we're really not very sure what's going on. Well, sure, fine. Maybe we can live with that. But what about the bombings of Syria in 2007?
I'd like to interject here.
That was 4 years. That was 4 years before the so-called Arab Spring. What about all the repeated incursions and invasions of Lebanon throughout the years? How do you explain that, Dan?
Okay, Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, Peter, Israel has been very restrained in recent years, but when rockets fly into Israeli territory, or when infiltrators cross its borders, or when there's a buildup of Iranian forces and Hezbollah forces along the borders, and when there are convoys of sophisticated weapons going from
Israel
the Assad regime, from Iran through the Assad regime to Hezbollah, then Israel cannot sit idly by and not act. I'm very sorry.
But
Israel has to respond to that. And Israel has been very restrained in that regard for a long time.
All right, here,
Israel is an occupying power.
Okay.
Israel has occupied the Golan
What occupying power?
in
What are you talking about?
1967 and annexed the Golans
not in Syrian
illegally.
territory nor in Lebanese territory. Israel is at the international border
occupying
right now.
Palestinian lands. Israel is occupying the Sheba farms in Lebanon. Israel is an aggressive pariah state and occupying power. What's right? What right do you give yourself to go and decide to be an occupying power, to maintain your military power and control over other nations, and still set parameters of how you control and gauge their reaction?
Ramzy, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, and Israel has the right to defend itself by itself, and it feels under
sell this
threat,
somewhere
it will
else.
respond.
Don't sell it on
All right,
RT.
gentlemen, I'm going to jump in here. I want to go to...
Maybe Fox News will buy that, but not RT. They will not buy it. I'm sorry.
Martin, I want to go to Martin in Beirut here. When Donald Trump was inaugurated president of the United States, he said he wanted a plan, an immediate plan to wipe out ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, whatever you want to call it, in Syria. And we have a meeting coming up of the 68 coalition partners, and Russia and Iran are not invited to that when in dealing with Syria. And the irony is, of course, is that Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah isn't a state, it's a resistance movement, but they're the ones that are carrying the water here. They're doing the heavy lifting, and they're not invited to a conference dealing with Syria? That's just lunacy. Go ahead, Martin.
Well, I think there's a lot of irony, which has been piling up in recent weeks. The irony, I think, right now is we have statements coming from Donald Trump and coming from his people about a longer-term plan which he has in the Middle East, which is going to completely throw Syria into complete disarray. You know, some of your guests have been talking about Israel, and I'm frankly so tired of hearing this cliche that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Give me a break. You know, I mean, let's look at what's really happening. We have confusion in this part of the world. We have Donald Trump talking about a whole new anti-Iran agenda.
Syria is a democracy. It's a joke.
No, we haven't got time to talk about democracies in the Middle East. But you know, if you look at the aggressive reaction that Israel has towards Lebanon, towards Syria, it's usually driven by very short-term political gains by people like Netanyahu and others. You know, it wouldn't be such a bad thing if Israel was a dictatorship like most other Arab countries. We probably wouldn't have these acts of aggression. But go back to the original point. You're talking about Trump, Peter. What worries me is that we have this very, very short-sighted policy coming from Trump's people, which is, broadly speaking, a whole new agenda on Iran, a new anti-Iran agenda, a program which is set out to marginalize Iran, and more importantly, because it's easier, because it's lower-hanging fruit, marginalize Iran's proxies. But that's completely confusing to me, and I think it's confusing to the Israelis. They must be very worried now. You know, the Iranians must be laughing their heads off, watching the news every day and seeing Trump's initiatives whereby they bomb al-Qaeda in Yemen, whereby al-Qaeda in Yemen were actually fighting Hutus, which apparently are backed by the Iranian regime. And if you carry on with this short-term idea that Trump has of just hitting Daesh everywhere, hitting ISIS, you know, it has some noble aspect to it, but it's only short-term political public relations gains that he's looking for. The Iranians and the Israelis know very well that if he carries on doing that, when it comes to actually hitting Iran, in inverted commas, there won't be anybody around to sign up to fight the Iranians or Hezbollah or Syria or the Syrians. So, you know, I think the Israelis know that the conundrum of Syria is really the problem. You know, if Israel doesn't want to hit Daesh, it doesn't want to hit Nusra. I mean, it has a sort of a working alliance with Nusra. It would much prefer those extremist, hardcore Sunni groups to actually stay in their territories and keep the pressure on.
Let me ask Dan. I mean, why is that? I mean, Israel has this nominally this neutral position, which doesn't facts belie that. That's not true. But it would seem that these radical Islamists would be your natural enemy, but you don't see it that way. I mean, here you have the Russians, you have the Americans, you have the Iranians, the very strange bedfellows, and they do see that these terror groups are a threat to world security. But Israel doesn't. Why? Go ahead, Dan.
Well, first of all, I think that regarding the talks, and I think that until the U.S. president and the Russian president sit down and discuss this, then there will be an anomaly in which the U.S. does not participate in the Astana talks, while the Russians are not here in Washington tomorrow in this conference. I think Iran is a side issue. I think Iran should not be in this conference tomorrow in Washington. But to your question about ISIL, about Israel and ISIS, I think Israel has not been, ISIS is very careful in one thing, not challenging Israel directly. ISIS has not, since this Arab Spring started, since ISIL came to the scene, it has been very cautious as to targeting or to challenging Israel directly. Israel is monitoring the situation closely, watching what ISIS is doing very closely. But until ISIS opens a front, it does not choose to open a front with ISIS. Obviously, in the competition between ISIS and the Assad regime and other forces within Syria, Israel chooses not to side with any of the parties. Once one of the parties comes to power or dominates the other power, then Israel will deal with it. Right now, Israel is not opening a new front with ISIS.
Okay, Ramzy, would you like to respond to that? Because
it has enough fronts to deal with at the moment.
Ramzy in Seattle, I mean, Israel has one of the largest, most sophisticated militaries in the world. It's right next door, and they're watching very carefully. I find it really inexcusable, I'm sorry, almost amoral to watch this continue to go on when it can be, if there could be a coalition, a temporary one, like the Second World War. Odd bedfellows get... Let me finish.
What's Russia doing versus ISIS?
Well, oh, really? You haven't been following the news then? Okay, why do you think that the Arab Syrian army has been able to go on the march here? That's kind of, let's not go into the weeds, Dan. Let me finish with Ramzy here. I mean, a temporary coalition to wipe out this scourge, and I think it would be for everyone's benefit, including Israel's, actually. Go ahead, Ramzy.
I think Dan's answer is really rather telling about the attitude of Israel towards terrorism in general. I mean, the idea that they would brand Palestinians trying to defend themselves in the occupied territory as terrorists, and ISIS with this extremely dark, violent agenda. As long as they are not really threatening us, we don't have a problem with them. Well, fine. How about Syria? Syria hasn't been really leading an army attacking Israel. Why do you keep attacking the Syrian army while they are battling the ISIS forces in Palmyra? Why do you strike the Syrian army during very specific and sensitive times of their battles against ISIS? I'm going to leave it at that, but I think it's very clear what Israel is trying to do. They want to maintain this perpetual chaos. They want to ensure that no party has the upper hand over the other party. I think this silliness about, they are transferring sophisticated weapons to Hezbollah. What are you talking about? Hezbollah is fighting a shared war. They are on the same front with the Syrian government and the Syrian army. They are sharing arsenals and they are sharing battle plans. It makes no sense for you to keep using this excuse over and over again.
In Lebanon,
I think it's really interesting. I think it's really interesting to see how the direction of the Israeli 4 airplanes that bombed Palmyra, how they flew over Al-Qaeda bases, flew over ISIS bases, kept them completely untouched. And when they reached their targets near Palmyra, they hit the Syrian army and they went back. And as if ISIS and Al-Qaeda don't exist as terrorist forces in the region. I think it's very telling, and I don't think Israel is not involved. This whole idea, we are just waiting to see what happened at the end. It's really hogwash. It's not true at all.
All right.
Israel has been very involved.
Okay, I want to be fair here. Dan, go ahead, weigh in. You'll have the last word on the program. Go ahead, Dan.
Well, Ramzy goes to the classic. Ramzy goes to the classic Israel blaming arguments. All Israel's fault, of course. Russia in Syria, that's Israel's fault. And ISIS in Syria, it's Israel's fault. Of course, you can go ahead and tell your theories to yourself. But seriously, the situation in Syria is very troubling.
I did not say that.
Israel is very troubled by the continuation of the atrocities in Syria. Israel would like to see the Syrian conflict solved diplomatically. And the forces that are operating in Syria in their arena right now are operating irresponsibly, and having Iran there only adds to the mix. Iran is part of the problem, not a part of the solution.
But Dan, Iran was invited.
Very carefully its targets.
Iran was invited legally under international law. We've run out of time, gentlemen. Many thanks to my guests in Washington, Seattle, and in Beirut. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, Crosstalk rules.
I love you.